But the Turks still ruled over the crossroads of the world, collision point of the imperial ambitions of the European powers. The Middle East, Egypt and the Persian Gulf, was the key to the British hold on her Indian Empire. To keep the Middle East safe from France, Nelson had sunk Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. To keep it safe from Russia, Britain had fought the Crimean War. Since its opening in 1869, the Suez Canal had become the direct route linking Britain to India and Australia and New Zealand. And since 1882, the British had been the paramount power in Egypt. The early years of the 20th century had added another reason for British concern about the Middle East. Oil. In 1908, oil had been discovered in Persia, not far from the head of the Persian Gulf. In the new age of aircraft and motor transport, oil was becoming vital for Britain. The Navy, too, was changing over from coal to oil. Unlike coal, which lay safe under British fields, this new fuel was in lands that might be menaced by hostile powers. From London and from Delhi, the British continued to keep watch on the Middle East. The eyes of the German Empire were also fixed on the head of the Persian Gulf. Through the Balkans, through Turkey itself, and across the sands of Mesopotamia, there lay Germany's road to the east, a road for her busy salesmen and industrialists. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway. By 1914, all but 400 miles had been completed. Germany's interest in the Middle East had been proclaimed by the Kaiser's state visit to Turkey and the Holy Land in 1898.
His Majesty the Sultan and the 300 million Muslims who revere him as Caliph may rest assured that they will always have a friend in the German Emperor.
When the Kaiser visited Turkey again, 19 years later, the war between the nations of Europe had engulfed Turks and Arabs and Jews and Egyptians alike. But he had redeemed his promise. In 1914, Germany gave Turkey the warships Goeben and Breslau to replace two Turkish ships being built in British yards and seized for the Royal Navy. Britain's act of seizure and Germany's gesture of friendship pulled Turkey from neutrality into war. In Constantinople, the crowds were in holiday mood. But the Kaiser saw them, and all their fellow Muslims everywhere, as a means of destroying Britain's Indian Empire, that empire which tormented him with envy.
We must inflame the whole Mohammedan world to frantic rebellion against this detestable, treacherous, conscienceless nation of shopkeepers. For if we are to bleed to death, England shall at all events lose India.
Turkey went to war with a German-trained, German-equipped and German-advised army, recruited from some of the toughest fighting stock in the world. Which way would the Turks march? Across the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal? Down the Tigris and Euphrates to the oil fields of Persia? For the British, the loss of either would have been a catastrophe. In London and Delhi, orders were given. Convoys of troops sailed to parry the Turkish threat. Indians and Australians and New Zealanders to Egypt, British and Indians to the Persian Gulf. The expedition from India landed at the head of the Gulf and marched on to capture Basra, the Turkish port where the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates flowed sluggishly to the sea. The army discovered Mesopotamia, where even the towns were crumbling heaps of mud houses. An Arab proverb said,
"When Allah had made hell, he found it not bad enough. So he made Mesopotamia, added flies.
Gradually, a primitive base was built up amid the palm groves of Basra. More troops arrived to share the flies and the dysentery. The oil fields were safe. There seemed nothing more for the army to do. But its new commander, Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon, was not a man to rest on the defensive.
It was a very fractured society. Tribalism was very strong in many parts, and in fact, most people were either rural or tribal. The cities were small and few, and the Ottomans governed through a rather thin administration, mainly of Ottoman Turks, but with some Arabs as well. And it was Islam, the belief in Islam, Islamic institutions, and so on that held it together.
Early in the 19th century, the Ottomans imposed central authority over the region. They divided it into 3 administrative districts that would become the forerunner of modern Iraq: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. In fact, Basra, near Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf, was quickly growing into a center for international trade. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottomans would have to contend with foreigners who had an eye on their wealth.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq.
In 1908, crude oil was discovered in Iran. Winston Churchill, Britain's civilian head of the Royal Navy, was convinced that oil, not coal, was the fuel of the future. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to develop the new industry.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq. British investments increased, British presence increased, and already there were well-detailed plans to conquer at least the southern part of the country prior to World War I.
On August 1st, 1914, Germany, motivated by a desire for greater power and international influence, declared war on Russia. World War I was set in motion. When the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allies, the British found their commercial interests in the Middle East suddenly threatened. By November 1914, the British Army occupied Basra to defend the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields and refineries nearby in Iran. Beginning in 1916, the British engaged in a series of offenses that eventually led to the capture of Baghdad. They entered the city on March 11, 1917, under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude. 9,000 Turkish soldiers surrendered rather than put up a fight. General Maude announced to the people of Baghdad,
"Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators."
The British Army continued to move north until it captured Mosul early in November 1918. Britain then controlled nearly all of Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were defeated. Iraqis and Arabs from other Ottoman provinces in the Middle East hoped their long-held dream of self-rule would finally come true.
An Arab nationalist movement of sorts had already started before World War I. And many of the Arab army officers and civil servants and intellectuals who had been, some of them educated in Istanbul, were opposed to control by the Turks.
At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Arab hopes for independence were crushed when the Ottoman provinces were divided between France and Britain by the League of Nations. Iraq, as well as Palestine, became a mandate entrusted to Britain.
These countries were deemed to be almost ready for independence, but they were going to need help from foreign powers to prepare them for independence. Nation building, we call it today.
Arnold Wilson was the administrator in charge of the Iraq Mandate.
He argued that it was in British interest to bring civilization to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and that this could only be done through direct English rule over the country. Thus, he brushed aside any claims of Iraqis to participate in the governance of the country.
Enraged at being shut out of the new government, 100,000 armed Iraqis revolted in July 1920.
In the Iraqi view, of course, this is the first national rebellion against British colonialism.
It took the British 3 months to crush the rebellion. By 1921, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill was determined to end direct British rule and install a British-friendly Arab leader as King of Iraq. He invited Prince Faisal al-Hussein to become ruler of the new state, even though he was not Iraqi, but was instead a member of the Hashemites, the ruling family of Mecca.
Faisal was a descendant of the Prophet, and thus he had sort of religious credentials. He had Arab nationalist credentials in the sense that he was a leader of a revolt against the Ottomans in the name of Arabism. Generally speaking, he was considered to be quite moderate and willing to accommodate British interest.
In August 1921, Faisal was elected King of Iraq in a dubious referendum. The Hashemite monarchy was considered as foreign by many Iraqis.
The real problem here was the monarchy was seen as sort of a tool of the British, and it was the mandate itself that generated the opposition.
British control could not prevent King Faisal from leading Iraq toward greater freedom. At the king's urging, Iraq was admitted to the League of Nations as an independent state in October 1932. By the late 1940s, many Iraqis were dissatisfied with the pro-British monarchy, which was growing increasingly alienated from society.
Peasants were being driven off the land because they couldn't pay the loans that they had borrowed. So landlessness was increasing. The situation in the countryside was one of intense poverty.
Oil accentuated the class division. It had been discovered in the city of Kirkuk in 1927.
It allowed the government to enjoy a source of wealth that was not dependent on society. It didn't have to pay any attention to taxpayers and their wishes. There was the entire budget of the Iraqi government right from the ground, so it was not accountable to anybody, and this caused it to grow in arrogance and in isolation.
Inequality and social misery intensified Arab nationalist and anti-Western sentiments.